what would happen if you invited the devil over to your home for dinner? It sounds absurd and outright foolish that anyone in their right mind would open the door of their home to pure evil. The home is a safe place for the family, and we have doors with locks to keep the unwelcome guests out. At least if an enemy came to our home with intentions of attacking us, they would have to break down the door and force their way into our home. It's foolish to think that we would just open the door of our home to someone whose clear intention was to destroy us. As we have been studying Exodus for the past few Sundays, we have now come to the defining event of Israel becoming a nation, the Lord's Passover. At the beginning of Exodus, Pharaoh had enslaved the Israelites, and his thirst for power had ordered genocide of all the male Israelite children. Politically, economically, and socially, the Israelite people were helpless to oppose the brute force of the Egyptian empire. What is wonderful about the book of Exodus is that everyday events are viewed from a spiritual perspective, so that we can learn from Israel's encounter with the God who redeems them from slavery. The spiritual perspective in this text is described in chapter 12, verse 12, where God speaks to Moses and tells him the last plague of the death of the firstborn of all Egypt will be a judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh, in a spiritual sense, opened the door of his home to the power of the devil, inviting the devil to be a source of power to destroy the Israelites. As we studied last week, we saw the consequences of Pharaoh's decision. The very false gods that Pharaoh had trusted in for his source of power came to enslave him as Egypt lay in ruins from Pharaoh's stubborn refusal to acknowledge God as the true God. Now these counterfeit gods were coming for payment into the homes of Egypt in the form of death. Paul in Romans 1 explains this process of people trusting in counterfeit gods and how it brings death to our lives. Paul says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. So people are without excuse. But people have chosen not to glorify God or thank him, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles." Paul says, "Therefore God gave them over to their sinful desires." God allowed them to feel the consequences of their decision to abandon God. Furthermore, they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. He gave them over to a depraved mind, a mind that does what not ought to be done. God allowed them to be controlled by their sinful desires, Paul says. And although they knew God's righteous decree that those who do these things deserve death, they not only continued to do evil things, but also approved of those who practice them. So God allowing the first death of the firstborn of Egypt was allowing the counterfeit gods to claim them as their own. John Calvin once commented that if for one moment God withheld his protecting hand from creation, the world would fall apart into chaos. One moment, just one moment, if God withheld his protecting hand, there would be utter chaos. As I studied this passage, I recalled the story of Joseph. Remember Joseph? And that's how the Israelites came into Egypt in the first place. Remember, Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt. Joseph recalled and learned in his life, and he taught his brothers that, yes, you had sold me into slavery, but God used the slavery of Joseph to save many lives from destruction. Joseph was able to look at his life from a spiritual perspective. Just as God was with Joseph in his slavery, God is with the Israelites in their slavery and is providing a saving sacrifice through the Passover lamb that will define the people as a free nation. How are the Israelite families going to be saved from the coming destroyer, bringing death to Egypt? Would locking their doors be enough to keep out the destruction? No. They needed a sacrifice sign that set them apart from the Egyptians. In ancient times, pagans would place protective magic amulets on or near their doors to protect them and protect their homes from demons. What was going to be the sign for the Israelites? That their God would protect them. The blood over the door frames and the sides would be seen by God, and God would not permit the destroyer to enter their homes. Remember, we need to understand this passage from a spiritual perspective, or else spreading blood on the doorposts seems like a strange request from God, doesn't it? Verse 22 says the Israelites were ordered to take a bunch of hyssop and dip it into the blood and put it on their doorposts. Now, hyssop used to sprinkle blood became spiritually symbolic of purification and cleansing from evil. David later said in Psalm 51, verse 7, "Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, God, and I shall be whiter than snow." Remember, Jesus is significant. In John's Gospel, Jesus, when he was thirsty, they placed hyssop to give him drink. As well, eating bread without yeast took on a spiritual meaning over time for the Israelites. First, of course, it was meant to remember the Passover event and how quickly they had to leave Egypt without having the bread having a chance to arise. Eating bread was an everyday occurrence for the people, and the people would always knead their bread with a piece of fermented dough reserved from a previous baking, similar to a Mennonite friendship bread starter. Anyone ever done that? I've done that before. It's really neat how you can share this bread. But that's how the Israelites used to eat their bread. They had a starter from the previous day's eating. So to eat unleavened bread for a week each year, they would have this vivid reminder of how the Exodus was a new start for the people of God and what God had accomplished for them. Yeast was also a living organism that spread throughout all it touched. Biblically, this had both positive and negative aspects. Matthew talks about God's kingdom was viewed as the power of yeast spreading like a woman working yeast through a large amount of flour until all the dough was mixed with the yeast. But negatively, yeast was seen as the spread of evil around us. In 1 Corinthians, Paul uses this when he warns the church of not dealing with the case of incest in their midst by saying, "Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are." Says, and this is really important, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Before the Israelites had any laws, before they had any campaigns to raise any money for a place of worship, before they had any government or obligations to God, God redeemed them from slavery through a Passover lamb. Who is going to protect us from the destruction power of death? Who stands by our sides when we are most powerless in life to set us free from bondage? Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The grace of God was the defining moment in the history of the Israelites that gave them their national identity. The grace of God shown to us through Jesus' death on the cross is our identity. The book of Hebrews shows the spiritual significance of Jesus' sacrifice for us. In chapter 9, the writer writes, Jesus did not enter by means of blood and goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place of all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean, sanctified them so that they were outwardly clean. How much more then, with the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve and be free to serve the living God. Remember, it was Jesus who taught his followers at another Passover meal when he took a piece of unleavened bread and he added the spiritual significance of this bread as his body given to redeem us. Jesus also took a cup of wine and added the spiritual significance of the blood being shed over the doorposts of our hearts. Maybe the best response to the work of God in bringing redemption to his people is best expressed in verse 27 of our text. Then the people bowed down and worshipped. We've been doing some spirituals. I'm going to invite the praise team to come on up over our study of Exodus because of just the significance of how the spirituals meant a lot of the story of Moses meant so much to the slaves in America's South. And they just put a lot of it to music. The one we're going to sing today, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, was a favorite of Harriet Tubman, who escaped from slavery in 1849 and is widely considered to be the most famous leader of the Underground Railroad, which has a lot of connection to Ontario, doesn't it? Moses, she was considered like a Moses for her people. In 1850, she made so many rescue trips from Maryland that she helped about 300 slaves escape to freedom. Most of the code words in the spirituals, in this song especially, were used to kind of hide the underlying secret meaning of the lyrics. Coded words were a way for slaves to share the dream of freedom openly with one another, drawing inspiration and hope from the text. I'm going to explain a little bit. Swing low, which meant come down from above, for a slave said, come into the slave-holding states. Sweet chariot, heavenly vehicle, became a symbol of the Underground Railroad. Coming for to carry me home, coming to take me to heaven, said, come to take me from freedom in the north or in Canada. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? I looked over the River Jordan in biblical Israel, and what did I see? I says, came to me, I looked over the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, and what did I see? Became a symbol of the freedom beyond those rivers. a band of angels coming after me, a group of angels, the workers of the Underground Railroad, helping to reach me, take me to heaven, take me north for freedom. So let's sing this together to remind us of the spiritual language that God is offering us and the spiritual freedom that He offers us in life. Let's stand together.
Great Redeemer, you have washed our lives clean. And may we rest in the promise that you have come, redeemed us to bring us to be your people and to carry us to the home where we are safe, protected from all harm. We pray for those who are going through the ups and downs of life, struggling, that they can be reminded that there is a place where they are headed, that there is a chariot coming to lead them and guide them to bring them home. We pray for our community as well, people that are seeking power and wealth as their safety. May our identity as sinners washed clean by the blood of Christ spread throughout this community, that people will be told the story of a God who has redeemed us out of his grace and mercy. We pray for our community as well, that it can be a place where your love is spread and throughout. Lead and guide us, we pray.